Hello class, and welcome to the reading review video for Explication, writing about poems, and an introduction to the essay number 2 topic. As you can see, essay number 2 is to explicate a poem of your choice while citing from 3 secondary sources. It's very similar to essay 1, only now, instead of writing about a story, you're writing about a poem. It's a little more difficult to write about poems. You'll be making a lot more inferences and using your inferential skills because there's less information to deal with most of the time. When you think about the story of an hour, it was 22 paragraphs long. Most of the poems that you choose will probably be anywhere from 10 to 20 lines. Again, it's your choice. So try to pick a poem that interests you and that's not too long. As the book tells us on page 60, an explication is a close reading of a poem in which you make explicit what's implicit. So, just as we've been reading about explicit and implicit in writing logically, thinking critically, now we're going to put those critical thinking skills to use when we write about a poem and make explicit what is probably implicit. Remember, at the end of a poem, the author doesn't say, "Psst, and by the way, this is what the poem was about." Just like at the end of a soliloquy in Shakespeare, after Hamlet tells us how he's feeling, and we're not sure if he's pretending to be crazy or actually going crazy, Shakespeare doesn't say, "Psst, he's actually suffering from mental illness. He's not pretending anymore." So again, when you explicate a poem, it's a very close reading. And most of the time, very often, it's line by line. So just as you should have analyzed the story of an hour to make a point about life, right? Is she happy to see him at the end? With your uh, poetry explication, you want to do the same thing that you did with essay one. Consider the title and consider the ending, right? What do you feel is the point of the poem? Right? The story of an hour. Okay, so the point of the story was to tell us about what happens in Mrs. Mallard's life. And it's not just an hour, a random hour, it's a really big hour. It's probably one of the most important hours of her life. And we learn about her relationship with her husband. We learn about the fact that maybe she wasn't really happy in that relationship. And we analyzed the details throughout to make an inference about the conclusion. Is the joy literal, ironic, symbolic, or metaphorical? Now it's going to be a little bit more difficult because you get to come up with the question that you want to focus on in your thesis. If you're having trouble coming up with a question, use something very simply as what do you feel is the point your poem makes about life? Is it about love? Is it about grief? Is it about justice? Is it about revenge? When you go to any of those websites that I suggested in the prompt, poets.org, famouspoemsandpoets.org, if you Google top 50 poems, websites will pop up, poetryfoundation.org. When you Google top 50 poems and you click on it, it takes you to famouspoetsandpoems.com. And they have the poems listed by theme, um, by gender of the author, by country of origin of the author. So you really have a lot of options. And when you click on poems about by subject, there's quite a list. And I think everybody should be able to find a poem from there to write about. Again, it's your choice. Can you pick from the poems in this book? Sure. Can you pick from a poem that you personally like? Absolutely. Just make sure that it's published and make sure that you're going to be able to find sources on it. Just like with the last essay, when you go to the library database, start with your author, go to Literature Resource Center like you did last time, type in your author's name, and then filter or limit the search by adding the title of the poem or the theme or subject matter you're writing about. Kate Chopin, right? And then the story of an hour. And then you might have typed in oppression or identity. So for this one, type in your poet's name limit or filtered by the poem itself or by the theme? Do you want to write about, love, justice, grief, things of that nature? The last thing that you're going to want to do for this essay is consider the elements of poetry. So just as you use the elements of fiction on pages 76 to 79, when you wrote about a story, now we're going to use the elements of poetry on pages 100 to 104, right, in the section writing about poems. So just as you follow those directions for essay 1, follow the same directions for essay 2. Now, the elements of fiction in general still apply because poems, for the most part, are fictional. So plot, character, setting, style, symbolism, theme, they all apply as well. Now you get to add what? Well, when you're dealing with point of view and omniscience, instead of a narrator, now you have the speaker, as they tell us on page 100. So the speaker and the listener are two things you can analyze that fall under point of view. Imagery on page 101 falls under symbolism and style. And remember, just as on pages 76 to 79 with the elements of fiction, the elements of poetry in the section writing about poems, the paragraph after each one gives you a really good description of how to analyze that element. So please refresh with the paragraphs before you start drafting the essay once you've figured out which elements of fiction and or elements of poetry you're going to focus on. So we've got the speaker and the listener, point of view, imagery, symbolism, and style. Now, continuing style, there's a lot of things to consider when reading poems because poems are meant to be read out loud. Sound and sense. What sounds do you hear? What sounds are described, right? Think of the five senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. What about rhyme on page 102 under sound and sense? When authors make something rhyme, it's for emphasis. Just like whenever Shakespeare has something really important to say, usually the characters use rhyme. Assonance and consonance, repetition of vowel sounds and consonant sounds. Meter, think of meter as the beat. It's the amount of stressed and unstressed syllables on a line. And remember, they can only fit so much on a line of poetry, so that's why Shakespeare rearranges words so that there's the same amount of stressed and unstressed syllables. How does the meter provide emphasis? When you want to think about meter, have you ever sang a song maybe in the shower without the music behind it? And when you sing it, you still keep the beat when you're singing, right? I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. You keep the beat even though you can't hear it. That's what meter is. It's kind of the beat when reading poetry, and it refers to how many stressed and unstressed syllables are on a line so that when you're reading it, it flows. And it's also for emphasis. Form, the structure, how things are arranged, whether it's by stanzas, by lines, punctuation, things of that nature, that all falls under style, and stanza and form, the structure of the poem, also play a big part in emphasis. Now, the last element of poetry to focus on page 104, and possibly one of the most important, is lineation. Lineation refers to punctuation or lack of punctuation in the middle and at the end of lines. So the first kind of lineation is enjambment. An enjambment occurs when there's nothing at the end of a line. Why is that important? Because as a reader, there's no comma, so you don't pause. There's no period. You don't stop. You just read on to the next line. It's for emphasis. So it's kind of odd when there's no punctuation at the end of a line. So if there is no punctuation at the end of a line, we call that enjambment. And that's significant for emphasis. Now, the second type of lineation to analyze is called a caesura. That's how it's pronounced. It's spelled Caesuras. And again, enjambment and caesuras are both well described on page 104. Make sure if you notice punctuation in the middle of a line, right? It's kind of odd because technically, right, there should be punctuation at the end and nothing in the middle, right? You read the line and then you pause or stop. You read the next line, you pause or stop. If there's nothing at the end, enjambment. If there's something in the middle that causes you to pause or stop, or parenthesis, or an exclamation point, or a question mark, that's significant, and that's a caesura. Now, in order to look at this, turn to the right-hand side of your page, right? 104, caesuras and enjambment, and then on the right-hand side, William Shakespeare's Sonnet 116. Just read the first two lines for me. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bend with the remover to remove. Okay, now I couldn't just read the first two lines. Why? Because there was no punctuation at the end of the second line and enjambment, so I had to keep going. So notice how there's enjambment at the end of the first line. Let me not to the marriage of true minds, go on to the next line, admit impediments, caesura. That was me banging on the table because it's period. So the enjambment in the first line creates that build up because he doesn't just want to say, let me not to the marriage of true minds, and then have you pause or stop and think about that. No, the complete thought is, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Impediments is something that holds you back. So he wants to emphasize that what he's about to say, he's pretty gosh darn right about. Now, he can only fit so many words on the first line. So because he doesn't want you to stop reading until you finish the sentence, he has to spill it over to the next line. So the first two lines of Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, line 1 has enjambment, line 2 has a caesura and enjambment, which carries over into 3, 4, and 5. Okay? So hopefully this lecture helps you better understand how to explicate a poem. More to come when we review the poems that you're reading in this book. And again, feel free to call me if you have any questions. I think the prompt for Essay 2 is pretty clear and direct, but I'm happy to direct your attention to any particular authors, poems, or websites. Remember, biography.com is a good website to find sources. And whomever your author is, Google their name and they probably have a website. So in addition to a biographical document of that author on each of the three websites that I suggested in the prompt, famouspoetsandpoems.org, poetry.org, poetryfoundation.org, you also have the possibility of the author's own website, biography.com's website, and then the library database, go to the Literature Resource Center. So more to come. Stay tuned. Thank you for your patience. And last but not least, choose a poem that interests you. Choose a writer that interests you. Have a little fun with this. And drum roll, if anyone's looking for a suggestion, one of my favorite poets is William Blank. And he's got a pretty interesting poem called A Poison Tree. And it's all about wrath and anger. Just saying. Thanks for your patience. More to come.